Dear colleagues, we have been presented with two very clear introductions, one on the mechanics of the Bologna process and the agenda of it, and the first one by Chris on a rethinking and resetting of the university mission. We now have close to half an hour of question and answers. There are, I believe, microphones available for you in the hall, so please indicate by raising your hand if you would like to speak and ask a question. Who would like to be the first?
I think it's me. My name is Andrea Bührmann from the University of Göttingen, Germany. I liked your input very well. I have a question to Chris Brink. I think it was the second thesis. You said that excellence is not enough. However, what would be enough? Thanks.
Well, it's hard to say what would be enough, but what could be additional, what should be additional is once you've addressed the what are we good at question, once you have worked so hard on excellent research and excellent teaching, how can those be put to work? Other than just putting them out into publications and into your graduates, how can it be put to work? When I grew up as an academic in the 1970s and the 1980s, and the ethos at that time was your job is to be a producer of knowledge and a disseminator of knowledge. And if you do that well, then that's your job done. And I think now, 20, 30 years later, I think that was the wrong message. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. In addition to doing your job well, you should have a sense of responsibility to society, and that sense of responsibility should take effect by looking around you, taking note of all the problems globally, locally, nationally, and saying, those things that I'm good at, how can I put that into the service of society? That's the additional part. And I wouldn't be so bold as to say that would be sufficient, but it would go a long way to taking us forward as an integral part of society, not as a standalone entity.
Thank you very much, Chris. Who will be next? Yes.
Nina Schmidt, Institute for the Development of Education in Croatia. Thank you, Chris, for this interesting presentation. And since you spoke about responsiveness of university, could you maybe explain in more practical terms, how do you see that universities could structure this responsiveness, and how Bologna process could help in this structuring of a new job for the university?
Okay, thanks for that question. Let me begin by saying very simple, very practical. Look at your university's website and ask yourself if you are the shop assistant or the hairdresser or the bus driver. How much sense would your university's website make? Almost every university website begins by saying about the university, and then you boast a little about your history and your accomplishments, and then you say faculties, and then we say departments, and then you say disciplines, and then you have a section on the website that says give to the university. But very few universities have a part of the website right up front on the main page that says, here are the case studies of how we respond to societal challenges. Very few universities have applied their mind to say, we made an analysis we begin with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or any of the big global challenges. We made an analysis and said, this is our knowledge base. These are the needs, these are the societal challenges right around us, and therefore we are going to put our knowledge to work in such and such a way. And here are some examples. So in my half an hour, the only example I could give was the case, a negative one, of the case of the water crisis in Cape Town. How is it possible that you can have all these clever professors in water research and they don't feature when there is a crisis? Now, just ask yourself that kind of question. Around you, what is the issue? Is it migration? Is it poverty? Is it environmental degradation? Is it health? What are the issues around you? I'll give you another example from South Africa. In the early 2000s, there was an enormous crisis on HIV/AIDS because the government didn't quite recognize that HIV/AIDS was a virological problem. And so they didn't roll out retrovirals. And yet there were very clever academics who could tell them that this is what you need to do. You need to roll out a certain program. And it took so long before that message hit home. So we are not yet the trusted partner in society that we ought to be.
John, I would like to ask a question to you. You have documented the coming forward of the social dimension in terms of widening participation for the last 12 years since the London meeting. And it has been reiterated last time in Paris. What would you say are the most important hurdles that is keeping us from making this a national priority across the European higher education area? What are the hurdles?
Yeah, where to start, really? There's a lot. I think there's quite a lot of hurdles here. I think one of the big hurdles I've found in the work that we've been doing in the UK has been the relationship between schools and higher education. If we think back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, the relationship between schools and higher education was often quite a distant one. There were very tight boundaries around what a university should do and who it should relate to in the community. But I think now we're beginning to see a kind of loosening up of those boundaries, that higher education's reach and partnership and collaboration extends further than it did. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think we need to think differently about this kind of sector mentality and to understand that students and learners are just the same people moving through different parts of an education system. In other words, universities, schools, colleges, and so on are custodians of learners at different points in their journey. I think if we begin to understand what that means, the consequences for how we organise, fund, and accredit institutions takes on a different meaning completely. So I think that relationship for me is quite a key one. It also means, of course, that the idea of being involved in higher education starts very young. As we know from all kinds of social science research, the notion that cultural capital is an important factor in aspiring to go to university and succeeding in doing so is a very powerful and important one. And we're all distributors in one way or another of that cultural capital. So again, I think it's something that universities need to think very carefully about. Universities need to know their students better, who their students are, who the students could be. Are there people that are not getting a chance to access the opportunity of higher education? What do they do about that? Where does their responsibility start and finish? So I think these boundary issues are quite important ones, and I'm not sure we're making as much progress as we need to at either a national level, but certainly at a European level.
Yeah, thank you very much. So higher education is a part of a longer chain, and the weakest link may be elsewhere. So to get engaged in that and help improve is quite important. Yes, Carl.
Carl Dietrich, President of the European Quality Assurance Register. And I would like to ask a question on a kind of a different level of abstraction in the social dimension, because we are speaking very much about fair access, equal chances, participation. But there is also the dimension of inequality between the northwestern part of Europe and the southern and eastern part of Europe. I think that our strive for excellence has led to an enormous cleavage between northwest and southeast. And if we are talking about a social dimension in the European higher education area, is it not time to show up, to come up with some solidarity, to be able to give the countries and universities in the south and southeastern parts of Europe equal chances compared to the northwestern countries? I saw a report by the OECD, an index on talent attractiveness, which is so much directed towards the northwest. What could you do to gain brains, where all what we know is that what we are gaining will be lost in the southern and southeastern parts of Europe? Would you please elaborate on this point?
So I'll have a first go, and then I'll hand over to John, who's the expert. I could have added a fourth thesis, and my fourth thesis would have been, you cannot speak of quality without speaking of inequality. When we say we strive for quality higher education, that pervades our admission procedures, our examination system, our entire teaching portfolio. And that's good. And I support that. But if the playing field is not level, then you have taken a choice to only deal with the advantaged. And I think part of that social responsibility, part of that responsiveness that I plead for, is you must take into account the disadvantages. Now, I mentioned the Bantu Education Act of 1953 quite deliberately constructed an inferior system of education. After, you may remember, the first democratic elections in South Africa were in 1994. I was then at the University of Cape Town, and I was the head of mathematics. And mathematics is always the bottleneck. It's always the difficult one that the students have to satisfy the requirements in. And suddenly we had this cohort of black students who were very angry, and quite deservedly so, because the cards had been stacked against them, demanding access, and yet many of them were practically not numerate because of that inferior system of education. And so we adopted a principle, and the principle was we will be flexible on access, but we will be strict on success. So it's not just getting them into the university. It's also making sure that once they're in, they're successful. So when we deal with inequality, one part of the problem is access, but I think an equally important part is once you have them, you have the responsibility of making sure that they're successful. And I sometimes think we haven't paid enough attention to that dimension.
Just make one quick comment on the question. And we've had a lot of discussions in the UK about the word fairness and its use in this context, in the context that you're describing. And I think one of the conclusions I've come through to, listening to these discussions, is that there's a problem with fairness, and that problem is there is not enough of it to go round to everyone. So in other words, we kind of have this appearance, as it were, of fairness, but recognizing that when we look at the statistics, when we look at the data, actually it's telling us a different kind of picture. So I think we've got to be very careful about the way we understand what fairness is and think about the outputs, not just the inputs. And I think Chris raised this in his presentation. I thought it was a very good point. I think that notion of fairness can sometimes be illusory. It can take us into directions that actually the reality of student experience going to higher education is not that at all. It doesn't feel fair to them. They don't have a sense of equality. In fact, many students, I fear, have a sense of it's not for us. And it's overcoming those sorts of things which I think some of the big challenges are. And our universities need to rise to that challenge.
Yes, I would myself like to add that the inequalities that Karl Dietrich was pointing to are a very cogent reason to rethink some of our European policies. Yesterday, I was talking to a colleague from Tetova in North Macedonia, and he told me that his university had finally found the means to really cater for the needs of all of their regional population. But the European mobility schemes were drawing thousands of students away from their region and from their country to Germany and the northwest of Europe. So mobility has a very different practical meaning to a German university and the German economics, or the English ones, or the French, or whatever, than it has to North Macedonia. And to balance that in terms of fairness, to reset that kind of inequalities, I think should be on the agenda of all of us in this process in the coming year. We have time for one or two more questions. Who would like to use it? Yes, madam.
Birgitta Vuorinen from Finland. When we are talking about social dimension, we're usually talking about degree students and their access, retention, and graduation. But how do you see the role of continuous learning? I mean, the responsibility for other audiences than the degree students. From my point of view, and then Finnish thinking, we are more and more talking about continuous learning as one of the kind of responsibilities of our higher education institutions.
Yeah, let me try and answer that. I think one of the issues in a lot of European higher education systems is this fixation on the student experience happening around the age of about 18, being full-time and taking 3 or 4 years. That's the model. That seems to be the preeminent model. And everything else in higher education clusters around this kind of model of the higher education experience. But I know from my own experience of working part-time in Sweden that there are other ways of thinking about this particular experience and thinking of how we open up opportunities to more and different learners, which is the point I made in my talk. I didn't have time to elaborate, but I think too often the way that we offer provision it ends up excluding students that can't do full-time or can't do 3 years or are not 18 or 20, who might have family responsibilities, working responsibilities, caring responsibilities for members of their family. And I think higher education needs to think more creatively and more purposefully about opening up different opportunities for students that are coming to higher education from different circumstances. And I think if we don't do that, we are diminishing the opportunities that the society has to encourage more and different learners to be part of a higher education institution. Because when we have diverse intakes, we begin to excel. It's the point that we were both making in different ways, I think, that access and excellence go together. They don't exclude each other, they actually go together.
Okay, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Carmen from Alcalá University in Madrid, in Spain. Thank you very much for these presentations. I was thinking, well, I have been an academic for 25 years now, and I have seen several changes as a consequence of the marketization of university. One of them is that, well, I think academics are losing touch with reality because of the pressure to have publications, because the way we are evaluated is to have publications in high impact journals, for instance. And I would like to say that Spanish Ministry of Education has initiated this very year, an initiative to evaluate teachers by projects with high impact in society. I don't know what will happen. This has been an experimental initiative, but the philosophy underlying, I think it's in line with what with Professor Chris said, that, okay, let's think, what do they need from us? So if, as parallel evaluation system, let's say, okay, we can continue publishing in high impact journals, but I think there should be to exist an agreement, an initiative in Europe to have academics evaluated by how their research has an impact on society. And I would like to know if there is an initiative on a global or European scale. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's add two last questions. Yes, sir.
Gianluca Gaidano from Università del Piemonte Orientale, Italy. A resolution of the European Parliament, actually Resolution 2015-2977, called upon the establishment of educational corridors for students, university students, coming from countries at war, and some were specifically named: Syria, Iraq, Eritrea. I was wondering whether this could be considered as part of the social accountability of the universities, and where are we then in this specific project and call made by the European Parliament?
Thank you very much. Very last question to be included. Please hand on the mic.
Leonard van der Hout. I'm one of the Bologna experts, as we are called since 2005 or 6. We talk a lot about the social dimension, and I was wondering, how can we become more practical? Because when I was studying in the 70s, we had a very good relation with the city, with all kinds of agencies, organizations. Something has happened in, well, the last 20, 30 years that we moved again to ivory towers. How can we get out? And I would suggest bring the students more into the university, give them a job, involve them in policy making, and not only one in the board, but as I say, my student affairs department, we have about 20 students on different topics, and I would suggest maybe also in Erasmus, we could set up kind of task forces with good examples so that we make it really practical.
Thank you very much. These were the last 3 points. The overriding importance of academic publications, the responsibility towards refugees, and how to translate this into practical terms. And your last opportunity, John.
Can I start, because I need to run.
Yeah, you are leaving, so you're running around in a minute.
I just want to pick up on one or two. Chris will probably respond to some of the others, I'm sure. I just think that we need to think about the word relevance. How relevant are our universities to the communities that they serve? And when you ask people who have never been to higher education, where does a university affect their lives? very hard to see that very often. Very hard to see. It's kind of invisible. I'm sure it does, because they all need dentists, they need lawyers, they need engineers, they need doctors, they need nurses, all those professions and others that we all rely upon in some way or other. But often when you meet people, which I do, and particularly parents of young people that are coming to the University of East London, their knowledge and relevance of what the university is about is very little indeed. So I think we need to double our efforts here. We need to find ways of connecting, of reaching out to more and different communities, and think with them about what their needs are from a university. What do they require? What do they need from a university? How can that be expressed in a way that can have the kind of changes that I think at least two of the questioners had in mind in their question? So I think we need to think more creatively as universities. In London, for example, we're spending a lot of money on reaching out to different learners and so on. But I suspect there's a lot of duplication of effort, and we need to think differently about how we cooperate around these things in a situation where market forces are beginning to affect those areas. So I think those are some of the comments. I'm sure Chris will pick up on that last point, though.
Chris, final words.
Thank you. Let me begin with Carmen's question. There are some developments on the impact of our research on society. In the UK, since 2014, it is part of what was called the research assessment exercise. Now, you may or may not know about this, but in the UK and in a few other countries, every 5 or 6 years, the entire higher education sector goes into an almighty convulsion because there's a national evaluation of research excellence. And it was always only the outputs until 2014, when for the first time there was a parameter called impact. And the question was simple: what impact has your research had? And the evaluation methodology is different. For your research outputs, you submit numbers. How many publications, what journals, what impact factor, and so on. But for the societal impact, you submit case studies. And so if you Google RAE, or REF as it is called, Research Excellence Framework 2014, you will get a database with literally thousands of case studies of societal impact. And that will repeat in the next one, 2021. It's also happening in Hong Kong, for example. I chair the implementation group for the research assessment exercise in Hong Kong 2020. And it changed the academic mindset, because no longer do you only think about outputs, you also think about the impact on society, because that is a way of getting another appointment, a promotion inside your university. It's a way of getting more funding. Most things in academic life will change if the funding parameters change, because the academics will always chase the money. That is something that we are really good at. We find the funding opportunities and we maximize them. So in the sector, in the higher education sector, it should become part of government policy that the reward for research is not only about your output, but also about your impact. Inside the university, the mindset will not change until such time as the promotions criteria change. As long as academics are only promoted to professor on the basis of their research, or mainly their research, the situation will not change. If you can design, as has been done, a promotion system where people can get credit for their societal work based on either their research or their teaching or both, that will be a very powerful driver for change.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleagues and friends, for being such an attentive audience, stimulating to the speakers. And thank you very much, John and Chris, for inspiring us and for making it absolutely clear that the social dimension of higher education should not be an afterthought. It's not a matter of selling and communicating better. It really should move to the center of the mission of higher education. And we should be willing to change our own attitudes to get to those goals. Thank you very much, and please join me in giving them a great hand.